Eventually, I'm able to give the sub-lieutenant the bank manager's address. No Russian ever even laid eyes on this bank. The glass sign out by the street that used to announce its presence is now nothing more than a few splinters dangling from a couple of screws. There's one more branch of the Deutsche Bank at the edge of our district. We make our way there. The sun is burning. I drag myself along, tired, weak and weary. The sub-lieutenant kindly slows down to accommodate me. He asks some personal questions about my education, what languages I know. And suddenly he says in French, very quietly, and without looking at me, "Dites-moi, est-ce que vous en fait du mal?" I'm taken aback, stammer in reply, "Mais non, pas du tout." Then I correct myself, "Oui, monsieur. Enfin, vous comprenez." All at once there's a different atmosphere between us. How is it that he speaks French so well? I know without his telling me. He is bivshi, someone from the has-been class, the former ruling class in old Russia. He proceeds to tell me his background. He's from Moscow, his father was a doctor, his grandfather a well-known surgeon and university professor. His father studied abroad, in Paris, Berlin. They were well off with a French nanny. The sub-lieutenant, who was born in 1907, was still able to imbibe something of the has-been way of life. After our first exchange in French, we grow quiet again. The man is clearly uncomfortable, unsure. All of a sudden he blurts out, staring ahead of him, "Oui, je comprends. Mais je vous prie, mademoiselle, n'y pensez plus. Il faut oublier tout." He looks for the right words, speaks earnestly and forcefully. I answer, "C'est la guerre. N'en parlons plus." And we don't speak any more about it. Silently we step into the bank lobby, which is wide open, utterly destroyed and looted. We trip over drawers and index files, wade through floods of papers, carefully stepping round the piles of excrement. Flies, flies, flies everywhere. I have never seen such massive swarms of flies in Berlin, or heard them. I had no idea they could make so much noise. We climb down an iron ladder into the vault, which is crowded with mattresses and strewn with the ever-present bottles, flannel boot-liners, trunks and briefcases slit open. A thick stench over everything. Dead silence. We crawl back up into the light. The sub-lieutenant takes notes. Outside the sun is scorching. The sub-lieutenant wants to rest, have a glass of water. We amble a little down the street, the deserted, bleak, silent street that we have all to ourselves. We sit down on a garden wall beneath some lilacs. "Ah, c'est bien," he says, but he prefers speaking Russian with me. Although he has a perfect French accent, it's clear he lacks practice, so that his French is quickly exhausted after the first questions and phrases. He finds my Russian quite valiant, but smiles at my accent, which he finds, "Excusez, s'il vous plaît," Jewish. That's understandable. After all, the Russian Jews speak Yiddish, which is a dialect of German, as their mother tongue. I look at the lieutenant's brownish face and wonder if he isn't Jewish. Should I ask? Right away I dismissed the idea as tactless. Afterwards I started thinking, with all the invectives and accusations the Russians heaped on me, they never once brought up the persecution of Jews. I also remember how concerned the man from the Caucasus was to let me know he wasn't a Jew. It was the first thing he said to me. In the questionnaire we all had to fill out in Russia when I was there, the word Jew was in the same ethnic column as Tatar, or Kalmuk, or Armenian. I also remember a female clerk there who made a great fuss about not being listed as a Jew, insisting that her mother was Russian. Still, in the offices where foreigners have to report, you find very many Jewish citizens with typically German-sounding surnames. Names that have a certain flowery ring: Goldstein, Perlman, Rosenzweig. Generally, most of these officials are proficient in languages and devoted to the Soviet dogma. No Jehovah, no Sabbath, no Ark of the Covenant. We sit in the shade. Behind us is yet another red column, another silent lodger, a Sergeant Markov. The door to the basement apartment opens a tiny crack. An ancient woman peers out, and I ask her for a glass of water for the Russian. Amicably she hands over a glass. It's cool, fogged up with condensation. The sub-lieutenant stands up and bows in thanks. I can't help thinking of the Major and his model etiquette. Always these extremes. Either it's, "Woman, here!" and feces on the floor, or all gentleness and bowing. In any case, the lieutenant couldn't be more polite, couldn't treat me more like a lady, which I evidently really am in his eyes. In general, I have the feeling that as long as we German women are somewhat clean and well-mannered, and possessed of some schooling, then the Russians consider us very respectable creatures, representatives of a higher Kultura. Even the lumberjack Petka must have felt something like that. Perhaps it's a matter of context, too, surrounded as we are by the remnants of well-polished furniture, the pianos and paintings and carpets, all the bourgeois trappings they find so splendid. I remember Anatole expressing his amazement at how well off the German farmers he met in the villages were, as the front moved west. They all had drawers full of things. Yes, all the many things, that's new to them. Where they come from, people don't have as much. Everything can be packed into a single room. Instead of a wardrobe, many families just have a few hooks on the wall. And if they do acquire things, they manage to break them very quickly. Russians take no delight in the mending and tinkering of typical German housewives. I saw with my own eyes how the wife of a Russian engineer swept the floor, then whisked the dirt right under the cupboard, where there was undoubtedly more than enough already. And hanging behind the door to their sitting room was a towel, where all 3 children blew their noses, the smallest one at the bottom, the older ones higher up, just like back in the village. We spend a while sitting on the little wall, talking and resting. Soon the sub-lieutenant wants to know where I live and how I'm getting along. He'd like to get to know me better, but right away wants to dispel any wrong ideas. "Pas ça, vous comprenez?" he says, and looks at me with foggy eyes. Oh yes, I understand. We arrange to meet that evening. He'll call up to me from the street. I'm to be watching out for him at the arranged time. His name is Nikolai. His mother calls him Kolya. I don't ask about his wife. I'm sure he has a wife and children, but what does that concern me? In parting he says, "Au revoir." I go home and report the latest news to the widow. She's delighted. "You better keep him. Finally, an educated man from a good home, someone you can talk to." Pauli and the widow also know some French. In her mind she's already seeing the provisions rolling in. She's convinced that Nikolai has access to food and that he'll do something for me, and by extension for all 3 of us. I'm not so sure. On the one hand, there's no denying that he's likeable. Of all the Russian conquerors I've seen so far, he's the most westernized. On the other hand, I don't have any desire to get involved with a new man. I'm still ecstatic at being able to sleep by myself between clean sheets. Besides, I want to finally move out of the first floor and away from the widow. Above all, away from Herr Pauli, who begrudges me every single potato. I'd like to resettle in the attic apartment, clean it up, make it livable. Why should I sleep with someone to procure food for that lazy Pauli? Sleeping for food is another new concept, with its own vocabulary, its own specialized jargon, just like my major's sugar, rape shoes, plunder wine, and coal filching. Moving on, late at night. Towards 8 p.m. I was waiting by the window as arranged, but there was no Nikolai. Herr Pauli made fun of me, saying my conquest was so unfaithful. The widow, still hopeful, kept her eye on the clock. Then, as it was getting dark, a call came from outside. "C'est moi!" I opened the door, now all worked up, and led Nikolai upstairs to our apartment. But he'd just come to say he couldn't stay longer than a quarter of an hour. He greeted the widow and Herr Pauli ceremoniously in French, and left right away with his "Au revoir." In the hallway he said, in Russian, as he shook my hand, "Until Sunday, at 8, and then in French, Vous permettez? Since when are we in a position to permit it or not to permit? Maybe there really is a new wind blowing our way. Incidentally, Nikolai doesn't think there will be an inflation or a new currency. I asked him this morning. He thinks the money we've been using will stay in circulation for the time being, but that the banking industry will be overhauled and drastically simplified. Probably socialized, right? I asked. No, he said, not that. These are completely different conditions. And he changed the subject. Thursday, 17th of May, 1945. Up early to get water at the new hydrant. There's a newspaper hanging in a shop window, the Tägliche Rundschau, printed by the Red Army for the population of Berlin. We're no longer a people, only a population, present and accounted for, but representative of nothing. This same linguistic differentiation, Bevölkerung as opposed to Volk, occurs in other languages too, as in the French peuple and population. Reading about the victory celebrations in Moscow, Belgrade, Warsaw leaves a bitter taste. They say Count Ferencz has addressed the German people, called on them to face facts. Of course, we women have been doing that for a long time. But who knows what will happen once the generals and Gauleiters and holders of the Knight's Cross start doing the same? I'd be curious to know just how high the suicide rate in Germany is at the moment. Herr Pauli is sounding an optimistic note of late. Talks about a rapid economic upswing, about Germany's being brought into world commerce, about true democracy, and a spa cure in Bad Oeynhausen he'd like to treat himself to very soon. When repeating what I'd gleaned from Nikolai, I poured a little water in his wine. He turned genuinely irate, forbidding me to speak of things I know nothing about. I sensed that his anger went beyond this silly incident, that he simply fed up with me. He used to have the widow all to himself, taking care of him day and night. I'm a nuisance. After dinner, pea soup, and I ate to stock up, Pauli calmed down and peace was restored. The widow even insisted I take a second helping. I can sense my star is on the rise again, thanks to Nikolai. Should that bother me? Should I hold my apartment mates to some specific moral standard? I won't. Homo homini lupus. It's true everywhere and always these days, even among blood relatives. At most, I can imagine a mother going hungry to keep her children fed, but that's probably because mothers feel their children as their own flesh and blood. On the other hand, look how many mothers have been sentenced in recent years for selling their children's milk coupons or bartering them for cigarettes. Hunger brings the wolf out in us. I'm waiting for the first moment in my life when I tear a piece of bread out of the hands of someone weaker. There are times when I think such a moment could never come. I can picture myself getting weaker and weaker, shrinking away, no longer having the strength to rob anyone. Strange thoughts to have on a full stomach, and with a new Russian provider waiting in the wings. The news in the stairwell is that they've ferreted out a former Nazi party boss in our building, a Reichsanleiter or something like that. I don't know the Nazi rankings very well. I saw the men in the basement quite often, and I remember the blonde woman who had been reassigned and whom no one really knew, always holding hands with the man identified as her lodger, whom nobody knew either, two turtle doves, the cock being the boss in question. He didn't look like anything special, sitting around in his shabby clothes, and the few times he spoke he sounded stupid. That's what you call a good disguise. I'd just like to know how word got out. It wasn't his mistress who denounced him. According to the book-selling wife, she's howling pathetically in her fourth-floor apartment, where she managed to come through untouched except for 2 Ivans the first night. She doesn't dare go out any more. She's afraid they'll take her away as well. They came for him in a military vehicle. We have mixed feelings talking about this. A bit of schadenfreude cannot be denied. The Nazis were too pompous and subjected the people to too many harassments, especially in the last few years, so it's right they should atone for the general defeat. Still, I wouldn't want to be the one to turn in these former martinets. Maybe it would be different if they'd actually beaten me or killed someone close to me. But what's playing out now is not so much grand vengeance as petty malice, for the most part. That man looked down on me. His wife snapped her Heil Hitler at my wife. Besides, he earned more, smoked thicker cigars, so I'll bring him down a peg, shut him up along with his old woman. Incidentally, I learned in the stairwell that next Sunday is Pentecost. Friday, 18th of May, 1945. Up early to get water and look for wood. Slowly but surely, I'm developing a real eye for firewood. I hardly miss a piece. I keep finding new places that haven't been combed over, in basements, ruins, abandoned barracks. Around noon, Fräulein Behn brought us our new ration cards. For the time being, the widow, Pauli and I belong to the 5th and lowest category, others. Here are the allotments listed on my card. 300 grams of bread, 400 grams of potatoes, 20 grams of meat, 7 grams of fat, 30 grams of food items, semolina, barley, rolled oats, etc., and 15 grams of sugar. On top of that, there's a monthly allowance of 100 grams of coffee substitute, 400 grams of salt, 20 grams of real tea, and 25 grams of coffee beans. By comparison, heavy labourers in Group 1, which also includes well-known artists, technicians, factory managers, pastors, school principals, epidemiologists and epidemiological nurses, receive 600 grams of bread daily, 100 grams of meat, 30 grams of fat and 60 grams of food items, with a monthly ration of 100 grams of coffee beans. In the middle are Group 2, blue-collar workers, and Group 3, white-collar workers, with 500 and 400 grams of bread per day respectively. Only potatoes are distributed with democratic equality to all stomachs. Second-string intelligentsia are supposed to be in Group 2. Maybe I can sneak in there. You can sense that all this has had a calming effect. Everyone is sitting and studying their ration cards. We're being governed again. Those in power are providing for us. I'm amazed we're supposed to get as much as we are, but I doubt it will be possible to distribute the rations punctually according to schedule. The widow is happy about the real coffee beans and promises to drink to Stalin's health with the first cup. This afternoon I took a walk to the town hall, together with the woman from Hamburg and her daughter Stinchin, on whose account she had asked me to accompany them. It seems that Stinchin was a leader of some kind in the League of German Girls, and is afraid of possible reprisals, which I'm supposed to ward off by speaking Russian. The widow joined us as well. On the way we saw many people back on the street, hustling and bustling about. Even a lot of men, though women there are still clearly in the majority. I even spotted one woman wearing a hat, the first I've seen in a long time. Some guards had been posted outside a few of the banks I inspected with the sub-lieutenant. Generally this meant 2 Russians with raised weapons. Definitely not the best way to attract customers. Once again the town hall was like a beehive. We stood in the pitch-dark corridor and waited, surrounded by talk. The subject, pregnancy. Yes, that's one topic of interest to every one of us they managed to get their hands on. They say every second woman is pregnant, claims one voice, to which another voice, a shrill one, replies, "Even if that's true, surely for that you could go to anyone and have it taken care of." I heard that Stalin decreed that any woman with a Russian child gets counted as Group number 1, says a third voice. General laughter. Does that mean that for Group number 1 you'd— Absolutely not. I'd sooner do something to myself. The widow poked me in the dark, trying to catch sight of my face. I didn't want her to see me. I don't want to think about that. This time next week I'll know better. Have you been to the hospital? The question went down the line. No, what for? Haven't you heard? They've set up an examination station for women who were raped. Everybody has to go, on account of venereal diseases. Another poke. I don't know yet. I feel clean. I want to wait and see. Everything went smoothly with Stinchin, of course. Nobody asked about her glorious past. That's another joke, the idea of punishing minors for participating in things with the complete approval of their parents, teachers and leaders. If our forebears once burned children as witches, and I've read that they did, It was at least because they thought the children had been possessed by grown-up devils who were inhabiting them, using them as a mouthpiece. It's hard to define at what age our Western notion of responsibility for one's actions begins to apply. A woman from the building next door walked back home with us. She told us about a lady in a neighbouring apartment who had drunk and slept with the same Russian several times. Her husband, a clerk who had been discharged from the Wehrmacht because of a heart condition, shot her from behind while she was at the kitchen stove, then took his pistol and shot himself in the mouth, leaving behind their only child, a girl of 7. "I've been keeping her at my son's place for all this time," the woman explained. "I'd like to keep her for good, and I'm sure my husband will approve when he comes back. He always wanted a girl as well as a boy." The neighbours wrapped the parents in woolen blankets and quickly buried them in the courtyard, along with the pistol. "Good thing there were no Russians in the building," says the woman. "No doubt there would have been a ruckus over the banned weapon." We stood for a while in front of the graves on the grassy mound. The woman from Hamburg maintains that everything is bound to turn out this way, but if Hitler had been finished off on the 20th of July 1944, he would have kept some of his aura. Many people would have gone on believing in the dead man. Is he really dead now? Has he fled by plane? Escaped in a U-boat? There are all sorts of rumours, but no one is paying them much attention. The woman with eczema came over in the evening, bearing sad news. She'd walked all the way to Lutzowplatz to look up her boss, a lawyer for whom she had spent years taking down court statements. Because he was married to a Jewish woman and refused to divorce her, he had had to endure a great deal, especially in recent years, when he could hardly find a crust of bread. For months the couple had been looking forward to the liberation of Berlin, spending entire nights huddled by the radio, listening to the foreign broadcasts. Then, when the first Russians broke into the basement and went after the women, there was a scuffle. Shots were fired. One bullet ricocheted off the wall and hit the man in the hip. His wife threw herself at the Russians, begging them to help, in German, whereupon they took her into the hallway, 3 men on top of her, as she kept howling and screaming, "But I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish!" In the meantime, her husband bled to death. They buried him in the front garden. His wife has fled, no one knows where. Writing this sends shivers down my spine. No one could invent a story like this. It's life at its most cruel, mad, blind circumstance. The woman with eczema was crying, her tears catching on her crusted skin. She said, "If only it were over, this poor bit of life." Saturday, 19th of May, 1945. We exist without newspapers and with no sense of time, following the sun like plants. After fetching water and wood, I went shopping. The first things I got using the new ration cards were groats, pork and sugar. The groats are full of husks, the sugar is lumpy since it got wet, and the meat is stiff with salt. But it's food, nevertheless, and we're happy with it. "I'm curious whether your Nikolai is going to show up tomorrow," the widow said as I was putting the bags and packages on the table. In the afternoon we celebrated with a great house cleaning, set in motion when the widow cried out, "Look at that!" And lo and behold, water was dripping out of the tap, genuine thick drops of water trickling out of pipes that had been dry for such a long time. We opened the valves all the way, and a strong stream came shooting out, first brown, but soon bright and clear. No more water shortages, an end to the ceaseless fetching. At least for us on the 2nd floor. We found out later those living higher than the 3rd floor aren't so blessed. But even they can now get their water down in our own courtyard, or else from those below them. I should note, however, that our vaunted community, the communal sense forged by national identity and living in the same building and sharing an air raid shelter, is gradually eroding. In fine urban fashion, everyone is locking themselves within their 4 walls and carefully choosing the people they mix with. Our cleaning performance was first-rate. We turned our apartment inside out. I kept looking at the water, couldn't get enough of it, kept fiddling with the tap. So what if it ran dry towards evening? We'd already filled the tub to the rim. It's a strange feeling now, to have these technological wonders, these achievements of the modern age, reinstated one by one. I'm already looking forward to the day we get electricity back. In the meantime, while we were hard at it, the blonde who'd been relocated here and whose high-ranking Nazi lover was taken away 2 days ago came by for a visit and subjected me to a tabloid tale of love and fidelity. He told me that our love was nothing like he'd ever experienced. He said it must be the greatest love ever. Maybe that really is how the greatest love ever talks. But to me it sounded atrocious, as if her lines had been lifted from a cheap film or romance. She sat lamenting while I scrubbed the floor. Where could he possibly be? What could they do to him? I don't know. Anyway, she didn't dwell very long on that, and soon turned the subject to herself. You think they'll come for me as well? Maybe I should get out of here. But where should I go? Nonsense. They haven't posted any announcement saying party members have to report. Then I asked, do you know who squealed on him? She shrugged. I assume it was his wife. She was evacuated to Schwebus with their children, but she's bound to have come back to Berlin, to the house they have in Tretow. So she probably heard from the neighbours that he'd often been out there with me to pick things up. Did you know his wife? A little bit. I used to be his secretary. A typical example of what Berliners jokingly call a refugee camp, a sheltering bed for husbands who'd been ordered to evacuate their women and children, and were all too happy to comply. Of course, plenty of stories are also being told about the husbandless evacuees, the Muckis, the Mutter- und Kind-Verschickten, mothers and children sent away, about lovers climbing through windows and lots of racy goings-on. You can't just transplant the average human with impunity, given all his moral weaknesses. The familiar worlds of kith and kin, of neighbourhood, of polished furniture and hours chock-full of activity serve as a strong moral corset. It seems perfectly plausible to me that the enraged wife turned her husband in, maybe because she assumed his companion would be punished as well. "Ah, he was so delightful," she assured me, when I finally managed to steer her to the door, and she wiped away a tear. July 1945, scribbled in the margin. She was the first woman in the house to have an American. A cook, big belly, fat neck, the man keeps lugging packages up to her. Pentecost, 20th of May, 1945. A glorious day. From very early on, our street echoed with the footsteps of countless people marching off to visit friends and relatives in other parts of the city. We lingered over breakfast until 11 in the morning. Cake and a mix of real coffee and coffee substitute. The widow regaled us with all sorts of family anecdotes, her strong suit. Her clan is truly and bewilderingly droll. Her father-in-law was married 3 times, with long periods of bachelordom in between. He outlived 2 of his wives. So there are children and grandchildren running around from all the marriages, aunts younger than their nieces, uncles sitting in the same schoolroom with their nephews. On top of that, the widow confesses, the last wife, who outlived him, married again, and her second husband is Jewish. To be sure, this Jewish stepfather-in-law died long before the Third Reich, but there he was, a blot on the family record. Today, however, the widow goes out of her way to mention him, to the point of boasting about him. After our midday meal, I went up to the attic apartment, rummaged through the mountains of plaster and debris, carried buckets of rubbish downstairs, mopped the floors. I planted some chervil and borage in the rotting balcony boxes. That is to say, I made some shallow grooves and sprinkled in the brown grains and tiny black seeds that are supposed to become my kitchen garden. I have no idea what these herbs look like, except for the pictures on the front of the packages the woman from Hamburg gave me, from some of her leftovers. Then I lay in the sun on the floor of the terrace. A full hour of deep contentment, followed by unease and restlessness. I feel something nagging at me, boring into me. I can't go on living like a plant. I need to move. I have to act, start doing something. I feel as though I've been dealt a good hand of cards but don't know whether I'll be able to play them. And who am I playing with? The worst thing of all at the moment is our being so cut off. I went back down to the widow's and found her absolutely jubilant. Suddenly and completely by accident she turned up her late husband's pearl tie-pin, the one she'd stashed away and couldn't find, in the toe of a much-darned sock. How could I forget something like that? She wondered. Pentecost Sunday passed peacefully. From 8 p.m. on, I waited for Nikolai the sub-lieutenant, who'd asked me on Wednesday if he could drop by today. He didn't show up, nor is it likely he ever will. Herr Pauli couldn't resist the occasion to make a snide remark. Monday, 21st of May, 1945. This Pentecost Monday didn't feel much like a holiday at all. Hardly anyone is still employed. Berlin is on an extended vacation. While out for wood, I stumbled on a notice calling on cultural workers, artists, people in publishing, journalists, to report to the town hall today at 11. We are to bring records of previous employment as well as samples of our work. Off I go. The queue on the second floor is unmistakable. Full-fledged artists in their stubbornly unconventional clothes, theatre girls next to elderly female painters lugging paintings smelling of oil. Here, a mannish woman, there, a womanly young man with long lashes, probably dancers. I stand in the middle listening to the talk on either side, about famous so-and-so who was supposedly hanged. Until a woman's voice breaks in shrilly, "That's not right at all. Haven't you heard? It's just come out that he was half Jewish." That might be true, too. Everywhere you look, non-Aryans who'd been kept hidden deep in the family tree were being spruced up and put on display. Registration was just a matter of form. An older woman with Jewish features took down our personal data in a thick notebook, giving each of us a certificate of registration, and that was that. Will anything come of this? Some tip concerning work, some kind of assistance? Probably not.
End of Side 6. Side 7.
For our main meal, the widow opened one of the jars of chicken she put up in 1942, and has anxiously guarded ever since. Chicken it was, but chicken with a taste of mothballs. For years the jar has been sitting in the basement between mothballed rugs. By now it was completely permeated with the smell of naphthalene. That gave us a laugh. Even the gluttonous Herr Pauli abstained. The widow managed to get down a few bites and left the rest to me. I came up with a method of holding my nose and swallowing, but for hours afterwards I was burping mothballs. Around 3:30 p.m. I set off for Charlottenburg to visit Ilse R., who worked as a fashion photographer and as an editor for a women's magazine until she married an engineer, a specialist in armaments, and consequently someone they couldn't snatch and send off to the front. After a protracted exchange of goodbyes with the widow, I started out. Long streets, desolate and dead. Inside the tunnel, where there used to be lamps both day and night, it was pitch dark and smelled of excrement. My heart was pounding as I scurried through. On towards Schöneberg. In a quarter of an hour I met only 2 people, both women, one barefoot with varicose veins as thick as ropes. Everything looked so contorted and ghostly, possibly because of the sunglasses I'd put on because of the dust. A Russian woman in uniform with curly black hair was dancing on a wooden platform at the crossing, waving little red and yellow flags whenever a Russian car passed and giving a friendly greeting to the people inside. Her full breasts were dancing with her. A number of Germans carrying water buckets shyly squeezed their way past. No end to the empty streets. Then, all of a sudden, a crowd of some 20 or 30 people, streaming out of a cinema, where, according to the hand-painted signs, a Russian film called Chapyev was showing. I heard one man's voice, half in a whisper, pronounce the film absolute rubbish. The walls are covered with colourful posters, scribbled and scrawled by hand, advertising variety shows in various pubs. The artistes are the first on the scene. Bicycles were literally clattering up and down the boulevard, on bare rims since there aren't any tyres. This is a new and effective way to avoid Russian confiscation. Incidentally, a number of Germans have recently been finding bicycles of their own since the Russians abandon the ones they're riding at the first flat tyre, then look for new and better models. Onward through green residential streets. All was frozen, paralysed. The entire district seems to have been scared into hiding. Now and then a young thing came mincing by, all dolled up. The widow heard at the baker's that people are even dancing again, here and there. My throat was dry with nervous excitement when I turned onto my friend's street. When you haven't seen each other for 2 months, and what months, you have no way of knowing whether the buildings are still standing or whether the people inside are still alive. The building was there, safe and sound, but locked shut, no signs of life. I wandered around for nearly 15 minutes, shouting and whistling, until at last I managed to slip inside with one of the tenants. The familiar name was still on the apartment door upstairs. I knocked and shouted and called my name. I heard a shout of joy, and soon I was again embracing a woman with whom I had previously shaken hands at most. Her husband called out, "Imagine! She comes waltzing in here as if it were nothing at all." Ilse and I hastily exchanged the first sentences. "How many times were you raped, Ilse?" "4. And you?" "No idea. I had to work my way up the ranks from supply train to major." We sit together in the kitchen, eating jam sandwiches and drinking real tea they fished out for the occasion, and exchange reports. Yes, we've all been through a lot. Ilse got it once in the basement, the other times on the 2nd floor, in an empty apartment where they pushed her inside, using their rifle butts on her back. One of them wanted to keep his rifle with him when he lay down with her. That scared her, so she gestured to him to put his gun aside, which he did. While Ilse and I discussed the subject, her husband stepped out to visit their neighbour, as he put it, to get the latest news for me from a crystal set detector. As he left, Ilse grimaced. "Yes, well, he can't really bear to hear about that." Her husband is tormenting himself with reproach for staying in the basement and not doing a thing while the Ivans took their pleasure with his wife. During the first rape, down in the basement, he was even within hearing range. It must have been a strange feeling for him. We took advantage of Herr R's absence for a little female gossip. Ilse is a worldly, discriminating woman, very stylish. She's travelled all over the globe. So what's her opinion of the Russian cavaliers? "Pathetic," she said, wrinkling her nose. "No imagination whatsoever. Simple-minded and vulgar, every last one, from everything I've heard around the building. But perhaps you had better experiences with your officers." "No, not in that regard. Maybe they have the latest in socialist planned economies, but when it comes to matters erotic, they're still with Adam and Eve. I told my husband that too, to cheer him up." Then she says with a wink, "With food so scarce, a poor husband doesn't count for much. Mine is already getting a complex about it. He thinks that the Red Army with all its lady killers really has a chance with us women." We laughed and agreed that as normal suitors, under normal conditions, 99 out of 100 of our worthy enemies wouldn't have the slightest chance with us. At most, this 100th might be worth a try. We gossiped that way for a while, taking our mocking revenge on everyone who had humiliated us. The engineer really did bring some news back from the neighbours. Evidently Berlin is to become an international city for all the victors, and Leipzig will become the capital of the Russian areas. He also heard that Himmler has been caught. Still no confirmed news of Adolf. While Ilse seems very relaxed and manages to sneer at the recent state of affairs with ladylike superiority, her husband is dazed and distraught. His career has come to an end. They're clearing out what's left of his armaments factory. The Russians are hauling off the German machines. On my way over I saw several cargo trucks with huge wooden housings on top. Now I know what's inside. Herr R is afraid of social demotion, that he'll have to start all over again as a labourer. He craves contact and news, worries about surviving, is frantically looking for some job where he can earn his bread once again. He's applied at the hospital for something in central heating. He's still stunned by the defeat. Once again it's clear that the women are dealing with this better. We're not so dizzy from the fall. Ilsa and her husband are both learning Russian, although reluctantly he's contemplating a move to Russia, since they'll be shipping all the means of production out of here. He doesn't believe that we Germans will be permitted to produce much worth mentioning in the foreseeable future. He also heard from the crystal-set neighbour that the whole country is to be converted into one great potato field. We'll see. Repeated goodbyes. After all, you never know when and whether you'll see each other again. On my way back, I dropped in on the widow's shotgun-wed niece, the young mother-to-be, who's living with her friend Frida. She was lying on her back, looking very sweet, glowing from within. But her body was far too thin for her vaulted belly, which was literally jutting out. You can almost see the baby draining all the juices and all the strength from the mother's body. Naturally, no news of the father. He seems entirely forgotten amid the daily needs of finding food and fuel. Since there's only one electric cooker in the apartment, which is useless at the moment, the girls have built a kind of brick oven on the balcony and feed it laboriously gathered fir branches. It takes forever for them to cook their bit of gruel. Moreover, Frida has to constantly tend the fire, fanning it and adding wood. The place smelled of resin, like at Christmas. Then the long march back home. A poster in German and Russian proclaims the imminent opening of a free market. By whom? For whom? A wallpaper, a news sheet posted on a wall, announces the new heads of the city, all unknown dignitaries, presumably repatriated Germans from Moscow. Colourful troops of Italians stepping my way, singing, loaded down with trunks and bundles, evidently for the journey home. More bicyclists rattled past on bare rims. Schöneberg was more forlorn, and the ghost tunnel by the S-Bahn was black and deserted. I was glad when it was behind me, when I saw the buildings on our block. I returned home as if from a big trip, and divvied up my news. Tired feet. Humid day. Now the evening brings rest and rain. Tuesday, 22nd of May, 1945. By 6 in the morning, the widow was already up and moving about the apartment. She'd received a note from the building chairman the previous evening. Building chairman is another new invention. In our building the role is being played by the husband of the woman from Hamburg. The note, which was on a mimeographed scrap of paper, instructed the widow to report at the town hall at 8 a.m. for work, nothing more. It would be nice if it turned out to be cutting asparagus, she mused, making our mouths water at the prospect of a tasty dinner. So today I played housewife and cooked some pea-flour soup for Herr Pauli and myself. At around 2 p.m. we heard loud shouting from down on the street outside our house, a kind of official town crier, exactly like 1,000 years ago. He'd planted himself under the maple tree and was rattling off information from a piece of paper. All men and women between 15 and 55 years of age, capable of work and currently unemployed, should report to the Rat House at once for labour duty. That set off a great debate in the stairwell, to go or not to go. The bookselling wife cast her vote for. She was afraid that otherwise they'd come and take us by force. I joined her, and together we set off. I asked her if she knew what was going on with their bookshop. It burnt down at the end of April, she answered tersely. Nevertheless, she is pretty optimistic about the future, and told me about a huge crate of books in the basement that she managed to keep safe throughout the Third Reich, mostly forbidden literature. That is, works that were banned in our country after 1933. At first this meant texts by Jews and emigrants, later by opponents of the war. People have a craving for these things right now, she claims. We're going to wall off a corner of the shop and start a lending library, with a stiff deposit on the books, of course, or else they'll be gone in no time. I told her I'd be the first to sign up. I have a lot of catching up to do. The steps outside the rat house were filled with women pushing and shoving one another. The men were few and far between. With a great deal of shouting and gesticulating, a youth took down our names. The patch of street outside the town hall looked like an extremely busy construction site. The trench in the middle of the boulevard, which was carved out for mysterious military purposes by a handful of Germans and several Russian girls in quilted jackets, forced labour, is now being filled in again, this time solely by Germans. This has a certain logic for me. Women are pushing the carts loaded with sand, brick, rubble and fire-blackened debris up to the edge and tipping the contents into the trench. Bucket brigades have been lined up on all the side streets, and bucket after bucket is being passed up to the carts. I'm supposed to join in tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. I have nothing against that. I looked for the widow among the women working, but didn't see her. At one point a car with a loudspeaker pulled up, blaring the latest news in Russian-accented German. Nothing I hadn't heard before. This evening we had bread with canned meat. The widow still hadn't come back. It was 9 p.m. before we saw her red hat down on the street. She was absolutely exhausted, drained, done in. A few short, unintelligible angry sounds were all we got out of her. She refused to tell us what had happened. Finally, after an endless amount of time washing up, she managed to utter a few sentences, from which it was clear that there had been no asparagus. A Russian truck had transported the women to a machine works, where the widow and some 200 others spent the whole day packing parts in crates, then unpacking them, repacking them and wrapping them up, all under the eyes of stern Russian overseers. The widow had been jostled and shoved constantly. All they'd given her to eat was a crust of dry bread for lunch. And they call that organisation. She was indignant. What a muddle! What a mess! Then she told us some more. We pointed out to them right away that the iron parts were too heavy and would break the bottoms of the crates. And they just yelled at us to shut up and rabota, rabota, work, work. So when the first crate broke into pieces as soon as it was lifted, they really laid into us, and of course it was all our fault. Shaking her head, she added, "It's a puzzle to me how these people managed to win the war. Any German schoolchild has more sense than they do." And she went on listing other examples of poor planning and stubborn insistence on the part of the Russians, to the point where she couldn't calm down. She'd had to come home on foot, which took a whole hour and a half, since they hadn't provided a truck to transport the women back after work. As a result, she has a blister on her toe. She yammers on about that, and about our fate and the German defeat. Nothing can console her, not even the hammer, the pliers, the dust rag or the tin cup she smuggled out of the factory under her dress. Wednesday, 23rd of May, 1945. Fitted out with bucket and dustpan, I marched off to the rat house in the grey morning rain. Before I got there it was coming down in sheets. I could feel my knit dress soaking up the water. The rain kept coming, now a light drizzle, now a substantial downpour. Nonetheless, we kept on scooping and shovelling, filling bucket after bucket with dirt, so there wouldn't be a break in the chain of hands. There were about 100 women of all types. Some proved sluggish and lazy and didn't move a muscle unless one of our 2 German overseers was looking. It's always the men who get to do the supervising. Others went at it like avid housewives, with dogged determination. "Well, the work has to get done," said one woman with great conviction. Once a cart was loaded, 4 of us shoved it up to the trench. I learned how to operate a swivel plate. We worked until the heavy rain forced us to take a break. We stood under a balcony, huddled close like animals, our wet clothes sticking to our bodies. The women shuddered and shivered. We took advantage of the opportunity to eat our wet bread as it was, with nothing on it. One woman muttered in a thick Berlin accent, "Never ate the likes of this under Adolf." She was challenged on all sides. "It's thanks to your Adolf we're eating this." Embarrassed, the woman said, That's not how I meant it." We stood like that for over an hour in the pelting rain. When it began to taper off, our supervisor, a man with a Czech-sounding name and a Viennese accent, sent us back to the carts. We called these carts lorries, which sounded like a girl's name, and christened one the Laughing Lorry and the other the Weeping Lorry. But someone scratched out weeping and wrote smirking instead. Around 3 p.m, our Viennese overseer finally checked our names off his list and let us go home. On the way back, I was swinging my bucket gaily, in the spirit of "what doesn't kill me makes me stronger." At home I found the widow all keyed up. She confessed that for the past few days she'd been feeling this itching and burning, so she'd consulted the encyclopedia under syphilis and gonorrhea. As a pharmacist's wife, she'd learned a great deal about human ailments, but this was one particular area where she lacked the necessary experience. "I have these little bumps," she declared, very sure of herself. According to the encyclopedia, little bumps like that are symptomatic of early syphilis, breaking out 3 to 4 weeks after infection. The widow calculates that it was exactly 4 weeks ago that her stairwell rapist, that little beardless boy, had his way with her. "What, Vanya? That child? I can't believe it. You mean you think that he—" "Why not? Exactly, a stupid little boy like that. Besides, I'm not sure if that really was Vanya. How could I know? And then that Pole." The widow starts sobbing miserably. What am I supposed to do? There's no point in my taking a look, since I don't know a thing about it. And she fiercely dismisses my suggestion that she ask Herr Pauli. So all that's left is to wait till tomorrow and get to the hospital as early as possible, to the special clinic that's been set up for women who've been raped. Then I remember how my ears started to ache back in school when we were studying the human ear with the help of oversized anatomical models. It's likely that the widow's symptoms flared up when she read the description in the encyclopedia. We'll just have to wait until tomorrow. I may have to go and get examined myself soon. I'm 1 day late. Thursday, 24th of May, 1945. The alarm jangled. Time to get up for shoveling. Today I dressed in my blue training trousers and tied on a kitchen apron. Once again the sky was overcast. It was drizzling when we arrived. We shovelled diligently. There were 2 men shovelling alongside us, at least when the supervisor was watching, otherwise they didn't do a thing. All of a sudden, around 10 o'clock, we heard some shouting and a Russian voice. "Woman, come! Woman, come!" A command that's been all too popular. In a flash all the women disappeared, hiding behind doors, crawling under carts and piles of rubble, squatting to make themselves as small as possible. But after a moment most of them, including me, re-emerged. Surely they're not going to... at least not here, in the middle of the street. Besides, there's only one of them. And he now went into action. A lieutenant, evidently equipped with orders, rounded up the remaining women and herded us together. We trudged along behind him, in front of him, while he raced around us like a sheepdog, brandishing his rifle. We cut across the garden plots and finally wound up in front of a machine tool factory. The large halls lay empty, the hundreds of workbenches deserted. A German shout of "Heave-ho!" came echoing off the walls. A team of German men under Russian command were using cranes to hoist a disassembled forging press onto some train wagons. The parts were bigger than they were. Everywhere you looked, you saw men unscrewing things, turning switches off, oiling machines, hauling parts away. The siding outside the factory was lined up with one freight wagon after the other, several already piled high with machine parts. What were we women supposed to do here? We loitered about, not knowing where to go. We realized right away we couldn't leave, since all the gates were guarded by soldiers. Finally we were ordered to the assembly hall, where we were told to collect all the brass and other bright metal we could find and haul it in crates to the freight wagons. Together with another woman who stubbornly refused to respond to my attempts to strike up a conversation, I dragged out a box and went around picking up shiny bits of metal, copper thread, brass ingots, just like a magpie. I rummaged through the workers' lockers, finding pipes, crumpled handkerchiefs, neatly folded sandwich paper, all as if they'd just finished yesterday. Then we tossed our magpie booty onto the floor of a train wagon, where 2 women were clambering about, sorting the metal like housewives, nicely according to size. At noon we were ordered into a different hall, a kind of storage shed, with high shelves holding metal bars of every type, threading and bolts and nuts as big as a fist. We spent an eternity passing them all from hand to hand. The woman at the end of the line stacked everything in crates, as ordered. I thought about what the widow had experienced yesterday, and waited in some suspense for the bottoms to break when the crates were moved. But it never came to that. As soon as they started to lift the first crate, it was clear that it was too heavy. Not even our slave driver, a squint-eyed NCO with a chest like a cupboard, could make it budge. There were no wheelbarrows or anything of that nature. The man muttered a few crude curses and ordered everything taken out of the crates and passed hand to hand all the way to the freight wagons. In that way, a minimal amount of work was accomplished with maximum of effort. New labour details showed up, mostly young women, but with quite a few older ones as well. Word went round that we were to be fed, and indeed after 3 p.m. they ordered us into the factory canteen, where we found some steaming, thick bread soup. But there was a shortage of tin plates and spoons, so that each woman had to wait for the woman next to her to finish. Hardly any of the women ran up to use the tap. Most just gave their spoons a quick wipe on their skirts or aprons and then took the plates from the person before them. Back to work. Raboter. There was a considerable draught in the shed. This time we spent hours passing zinc fittings down the line. Finally, it must have been around 8 p.m. Our squint-eyed taskmaster showed up and shouted, "Woman, go home!" and started shooing us out with his arms as if we were a flock of chickens. A happy cry of relief. Then we went to the canteen, where we were given another 100 grams of bread. After that a cask was rolled in, with a thick white liquid streaming out of it, some kind of syrup. We queued up. "Tastes great," the first women to try it reassured us. I didn't know how to handle it until one woman gave me a piece of bilious green paper she'd found in the shed that I could fold and use as a container. "The green comes off," the woman said, but claimed that it wasn't poisonous. I showed up at the widow's around 10 p.m. and proudly displayed my booty. I scraped the gluey liquid off the green paper, and the widow merely shook her head. I took a spoon and licked it and wound up with a mouthful of paper. No matter, it tasted sweet. Only after a while did I remember about the encyclopedia and the widow's little bumps. "Oh, it's nothing," she said in answer to my question. "The doctor told me I'm all right." I drilled her a bit more, wanting to know what it was like at the clinic. "There were 2 other women there apart from me," the widow reported. "The doctor was a cheery sort. He fiddled around a bit and then said, 'Green light, track's all clear.'" She shook herself. "No, I'm through with that." Incidentally, an official expression has been invented to describe the whole business of raping. Forced intercourse. Maybe they ought to include the phrase next time they print up the soldiers' phrase book. Friday, 25th of May, 1945. Up again early and off to work in the clear morning. Women marching in from all directions. Today most brought their own dishes. I, too, had a soldier's mess kit dangling from my belt. We lined up as ordered, first in rows of 3, then 4, after which they spent an interminable time counting, sorting and registering us. Our supervisor was the same Viennese man who had been in charge of the carts. They say he's a musician. It took him nearly an hour to list all of us. Some women were new recruits. "Well, we have to work one way or the other," I heard one of them say. "At least here we'll get something to eat." Sure enough, we started off with some thick barley soup. Then we crossed over the railway embankment to the work halls, where we saw German prisoners slaving away, old men in shabby clothes, probably Volkssturm. They groaned as they lifted heavy gear wheel flanges onto the trains. They milled about alongside us, eyeing us intently. I didn't catch on, but some others did, and slipped them bits of bread on the sly. That's not allowed, but the Russian guard looked steadfastly the other way. The men were unshaven and emaciated, with the gaping eyes of wretched dogs. They didn't look like Germans at all to me. They resembled the Russian POWs